The wind howled outside, rattling the thin windows of the small cabin, and snow piled against the door like a relentless wall. Inside, Rosa White Feather stood frozen in the doorway, 3 pairs of baby shoes cradled in her arms, her hands trembling as if the cold had crept inside her very bones. The fire flickered low in the hearth, casting long shadows across the room, but it did little to warm her. Her mother-in-law, Margaret Standing Bear, stood by the tree, her face twisted with disgust, eyes narrowing as she pointed a sharp finger at the baby shoes Rosa had placed on the sideboard. "Take those monstrosities out of my sight." Margaret's voice sliced through the air like ice. "Now." Rosa's heart sank. She had hoped, prayed even that tonight might be different. That for once she'd be seen not for her size, not for the woman they had turned her into, but for the skill in her hands. The baby shoes she had crafted from scraps of fabric and thread were the closest thing to joy she had left in this house. "They're just baby shoes, Margaret," Rosa's voice wavered. "I thought they'd make the house more festive." "Festive," Margaret repeated the word as if it were something filthy. "This house is for proper people, not for your pathetic hobbies." Rosa's face flushed with the sting of humiliation. The other women in the parlor, church ladies, all of them had stopped talking. Every eye in the room was fixed on her. Their whispers filled the air like a swarm of bees, but no one dared to speak out. They all waited for Margaret's next command, as if she were the sun around which their lives revolved. Margaret crossed the room, her gait stiff and purposeful, and snatched the first baby shoe from the sideboard. She held it up, inspecting it like an item unworthy of existence. "Look at this, poorly stitched," she sneered, ripping at the seams with one swift motion. The stuffing spilled out in a mess of cotton and fabric like the guts of some unfortunate creature. Rosa's hands shook harder now, and a wave of nausea washed over her. The doll-sized shoes made with such care lay in tatters at her feet. She bent to pick them up, her knees weak with the effort. The others stood silently, not daring to look away. She could hear the women whispering behind her back, their voices cutting through the quiet like knives. "Poor Marcus," one whispered, her voice dripping with pity. "Can you imagine a man who had to escape from this woman?" The words hit Rosa like a punch to the gut, and she staggered back to the kitchen, clutching the baby shoes in her arms like a lifeline. She wanted to scream, to shout at them all that she was more than what they saw, but the words stuck in her throat. She couldn't afford to make things worse. Not tonight. The kitchen was a refuge, or at least it had been. Rosa placed the ruined shoes on the counter, her hands trembling, as she wiped away tears she hadn't realized were falling. She had worked so hard, spent hours stitching each one, making them as perfect as she could manage, hoping to sell them at the Christmas market. She needed the money more than she needed to breathe. But all her efforts were worthless in the eyes of her family, in the eyes of the women who had been judging her since the day she married Marcus. She grabbed a tray and began to arrange the petite fours, slicing them as thin as paper, the sharp edge of the knife cutting through the delicate pastries like a whisper. The tea was next. She brewed it in the fine china pot, her fingers sore from the constant scrubbing and the endless cleaning. If she worked hard enough, maybe they'd see her value. Maybe, just maybe, they'd stop looking at her like she was something that needed to be scraped off their shoes. "Rosa," a voice suddenly broke her concentration. She turned to see Peter, Marcus's younger brother, standing in the doorway. He was already drunk, despite the fact that the party had barely started, his shirt untucked, and his breath thick with whiskey. Peter's gaze was sharp, filled with disdain, and for a moment Rosa wondered if it was possible to feel so small that you could disappear into the floorboards. "Still here?" Peter slurred, his eyes flicking over her body, lingering on the curves she had learned to hate. "Still eating our food. still taking up space in our house." His voice rose louder than before, cutting through the tension in the air. Rosa's hands froze, her heart pounding in her chest. She could feel his words like daggers, sharp and unforgiving. The entire room seemed to close in around her, and for a split second she thought she might suffocate. "Peter, please," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "The guests." But Peter didn't care. He stepped closer, blocking her path, and the smell of alcohol hit her like a physical blow. "Do you know why Marcus really died?" He sneered, the words hanging in the air like a challenge. "The doctor said fever, but we both know the truth, don't we?" Rosa's breath caught in her throat, and the tray she was holding tilted dangerously. The fine china teetered, and before she could stop it, the tray crashed to the floor, the delicate cups shattering with a deafening sound. China shards scattered across the floor like broken dreams, and the tea spilled in a steaming pool. In the parlor, everything went silent. Peter's laughter rang out, a cruel, hollow sound that echoed through the house. The women stared, their faces unreadable, but their silence screamed louder than any words. Margaret appeared in the doorway, her face a mask of fury. "What have you done?" she hissed, eyes narrowing at Rosa. "I'm sorry. I dropped it," Rosa whispered, but she didn't feel sorry. Not anymore. "Clean it up," Margaret snapped, waving her hand dismissively, as if Rosa were nothing more than an inconvenience. "And stay in the kitchen until the party's over. I don't want the ladies upset by your antics." Rosa knelt down, hands shaking, as she gathered the pieces of broken china, the cold, sharp fragments cutting into her palms. But even as she cleaned, she could hear the laughter from the parlor, the sound of her own degradation. The door to the kitchen slammed shut behind her as Margaret returned to her guests. Rosa sat on the floor, the ruined baby shoes still clutched in her hands, and wondered how much longer she could endure the life she had made for herself. The loneliness was suffocating, and the cruel words of her family felt like they were closing in around her. But as the hours ticked by and the party raged on in the other room, Rosa made a decision. Tomorrow she would take her baby shoes to the Christmas market. If she could sell even half of them, she would have enough money to leave this place, to escape from the suffocating grip of her past and start over somewhere new. She didn't know where she would go, but she knew she couldn't stay here. Rosa set the baby shoes down on the counter, her hands now steady. She glanced toward the window where the snow was falling in thick, heavy flakes, and felt the stirrings of hope for the first time in a long while. Tomorrow was a new day, and maybe, just maybe, it would be the beginning of something better. If I was meant to be nothing more than a burden, why was I still here? Rosa sat at the kitchen table. Her fingers curled around the warm ceramic mug, trying to steady the tremor in her hands. The faint light from the early morning sun barely broke through the heavy snowstorm outside, casting the room in a muted gray light. She looked out the window where the landscape was buried beneath a thick blanket of snow, and her thoughts swirled like the wind outside. It had been hours since the party ended, and the house was still silent. The laughter from the night before had faded, leaving only the distant hum of the wind and the sound of her own breathing. The baby shoes she had crafted were now safely packed in the small wicker basket at her feet. They sat there like fragile dreams, each one stitched with painstaking care, made with the love and attention that she had learned from her mother before her passing. Rosa could almost hear her mother's voice in the back of her mind, reminding her that a stitch carried more than just thread, it carried meaning, it carried life. But today all the meaning in the world didn't seem to matter. She had hoped last night might be different, that for once someone might notice her, might see the work of her hands, and understand the depth of her soul. But instead she had been ridiculed, shamed, and ignored. The harsh words of her mother-in-law echoed in her mind, cutting deeper than any physical wound. Those monstrosities, Margaret had said, mocking the very thing that kept Rosa tethered to the world. She had crafted each baby shoe as a way to prove to herself that she could create something beautiful, something worthwhile, but instead they were rejected like everything else about her. The crushing weight of her family's disdain was a constant companion, one she could never escape. As the hours passed, Rosa felt the familiar sting of loneliness creep in again, more suffocating than before. The house felt colder than it had ever been, despite the warmth of the fire crackling in the hearth. There was no escaping the suffocating silence of the empty rooms. Was she really meant to be nothing more than a burden? The thought gnawed at her relentlessly. The bitterness of her past, the loneliness of her present, and the uncertainty of her future all blended together in a swirl of confusion. Was there any point in trying to change, or was she destined to remain the invisible woman she had always been? The sound of the door creaking open broke her thoughts, and she looked up to see Peter stumbling into the room, still drunk from the previous night. His face was flushed, his eyes bleary, and he seemed to sway as if the weight of his own words was too much for him to bear. Rosa stiffened instinctively, but she said nothing. She had long since learned that confrontation with Peter was useless. He was like a storm, loud, harsh, and unpredictable, and when it passed, nothing ever seemed to change. Rosa Peter said, his voice slurred but demanding. "You're still here?" She didn't answer him immediately. What was there to say? It wasn't as if she had anywhere else to go, not with the snowstorm howling outside, not with her past holding her hostage. The thought of leaving was terrifying, but staying seemed even worse. The house was a cage, and the bars were made of judgment and scorn. But where else could she go? What else could she do? "I'm still here," Rosa replied, her voice quiet, almost too soft for him to hear. She didn't look up as she spoke. She had learned over the years that it was better to keep her gaze down when Peter was around. It kept things calm. It kept the storm from brewing. Peter snorted, clearly amused. "You've got a lot of nerve, you know that." He stumbled toward her, leaning against the doorframe. "I bet you think the whole world owes you something, don't you?" Rosa's grip on the mug tightened, but she said nothing. It wasn't worth arguing. Not with him, not now. Peter's voice grew louder, more insistent. "I don't know why we keep you around, Rosa. All you do is sit in that corner making those things." He gestured vaguely toward the basket at her feet, his words laced with contempt. "Those shoes, those stupid little shoes. Why don't you just leave already? We don't need you here." The words hit her like a slap, but Rosa stayed silent, not giving him the satisfaction of a response. She had heard it all before. She had been called worthless, lazy, unworthy of even the smallest shred of kindness. The pain of it all had grown dull over time, like a familiar ache that no longer hurt as much as it once did, but that didn't make it any easier to bear. Peter took a step closer, his presence overwhelming in the small kitchen. "You know, I don't even know why Marcus ever married you." What was he thinking? His words were harsh, filled with disdain, and they cut through Rosa's heart like a knife. The memory of her late husband, Marcus Running Wolf, flashed before her eyes. He had been kind once before the illness had taken him. He had loved her in his own quiet way. But in the end, even his love had not been enough to shield her from the judgment of his family. Peter's voice broke through her thoughts once again. "I'm surprised you're still here, honestly. What do you think you're going to get from all this sympathy? No one here gives a damn about you." Rosa's throat tightened. She wanted to yell at him, to tell him how wrong he was, to tell him that she wasn't just some burden, some forgotten soul. But the words didn't come. Instead, she sat there, her shoulders slumped, the weight of his words pressing down on her. Peter laughed bitterly. "No one cares, Rosa. You're just wasting your time." He turned and staggered out of the room, his laughter still echoing in her ears. Rosa remained sitting, her body heavy with the weight of his words. She closed her eyes and took a long, steadying breath, trying to quell the storm that was building inside her. She had spent so much of her life trying to be something she wasn't, trying to meet expectations that were impossible to fulfill. Maybe Peter was right. Maybe she was just a burden to them all, someone who couldn't even make something as simple as a pair of baby shoes worth keeping. But as she sat there alone in the silence, a flicker of something stirred deep within her, a quiet, persistent hope that refused to die. She wasn't ready to give up. Not yet. She had made a decision the night before. Tomorrow she would take her baby shoes to the Christmas market. She didn't know if anyone would buy them, but she had to try. She couldn't live like this forever in the shadow of their scorn. She had to find a way out. The world outside was cold and unforgiving, but somewhere just beyond the horizon, there had to be something better. She had to believe that. Rosa stood up slowly, her resolve hardening, like the frozen ground beneath her feet. She would make her way to the market tomorrow. She would take that first step, no matter how small, and see where it led. And maybe, just maybe, she would find a place where she could finally be seen, not for her failures, not for her past, but for the woman she had become. She glanced at the basket of baby shoes one last time, the quiet promise of hope still lingering in the air. Tomorrow she would find out if there was a place for her in this world. Could someone like me, someone forgotten and invisible, truly have a place in the world? Rosa stood before the small, cracked mirror, staring at the reflection that felt more like a stranger than herself. The soft light of the morning filtered through the frosted window, casting pale shadows across the room. She adjusted her shawl around her shoulders, pulling it tight to ward off the chill that seemed to seep into her very bones. The baby shoes she had carefully arranged in the wicker basket lay beside her, their fragile forms promising a glimmer of hope. But doubt lingered in the pit of her stomach. Could she really do this? Could she take that step into a world that had never shown her kindness? She straightened her shoulders, taking a deep breath. Her mother's voice echoed in her mind. "You are more than your mistakes. You are more than what others see." The words had been a comfort once when her mother was alive, but now they felt distant. Rosa's past had woven a tangled web of rejection and judgment, and she wasn't sure she could break free. But today she had to try. She couldn't live another day in the shadow of their disdain, in the silence of a life half-lived. The Christmas market was just a few miles away, and she had made up her mind she would go, no matter how terrifying it was, no matter how much she feared rejection. She picked up the basket of baby shoes, feeling the weight of her decision pressing down on her chest. Outside, the snow had softened into a blanket, muffling the sounds of the world. It was cold, but it was a kind of quiet she hadn't heard in years. For the first time, the silence seemed less suffocating. As she stepped out the door, the wind kissed her face with its icy breath. The world was empty save for the footsteps she made in the snow. Her heart raced, but she kept walking, each step taking her further from the suffocating walls of her home. She didn't know what she was walking toward, but she knew she had to go. The market was busy when Rosa arrived. People bustled about, their voices rising and falling like the wind, filling the air with warmth and life. Vendors shouted to passers-by, selling everything from sweet rolls to handcrafted trinkets. The air smelled of roasted chestnuts, and children's laughter echoed in the distance. But despite the bustling atmosphere, Rosa felt like an outsider. She made her way to a quiet corner of the market, setting up her stall with trembling hands. She arranged the baby shoes, carefully arranging them so their colorful yarn hair and patchwork dresses might catch someone's eye. They were simple, yes, but they were hers. She had poured every ounce of her heart into each one, hoping someone would see the love stitched into every seam. But as the morning passed, Rosa's heart sank. No one stopped at her booth. The other vendors were busy, their tables filled with eager buyers, while Rosa's shoes sat untouched. She couldn't help but feel the weight of the rejection that had followed her all her life. Was she truly invisible? Could she not even sell a pair of baby shoes? By noon, she was ready to pack up. The dream of finding acceptance at the market seemed so far out of reach. She stood behind her table staring at the shoes, each one a symbol of the hope she had clung to. But even the smallest hope seemed too heavy to carry now. Just as she was about to leave, a little girl ran up to her booth. She couldn't have been more than 6, with bright, curious eyes and blonde braids bouncing with each step. The girl stopped in front of the shoes, her small hands reaching out to touch one of them. "Look, Mama," the girl exclaimed, holding up one of the baby shoes, her voice filled with excitement. "These are the most beautiful shoes I've ever seen." Rosa looked up, startled, and saw the child's mother, a woman dressed in a thick woolen cloak. The mother glanced at the shoes, her eyes briefly lingering on them before scanning the rest of the table. Her face hardened as she spotted the price tag. $2 for a rag toy. The woman's voice was loud, and Rosa's stomach twisted. The woman examined the shoe with disdain before dropping it back onto the table. "This looks diseased." Rosa felt a sharp sting in her chest. Diseased. The word echoed in her mind, and she fought to steady her breath. She wanted to speak to defend her work, but the words caught in her throat. How could she explain that these shoes weren't just rag toys? They were pieces of her heart, her only connection to the past she had lost. The little girl clutched the shoe tighter, her eyes wide with pleading. "But Mama, I want it." "It's perfect." The woman shook her head. "Absolutely not. We'll find you something proper." She tugged at her daughter's arm, pulling her away without another word. Rosa stood frozen as the mother and daughter disappeared into the crowd, the girl's disappointment still echoing in the air. She looked down at the shoes, her hope slipping away with each passing second. She had failed again. She wasn't worth the time, the effort, the love. Her hands trembled as she reached for the baby shoe the girl had wanted, her fingers brushing the frayed edges. And then a voice broke through the silence. "These are beautiful," a man said, his voice warm and kind. Rosa looked up to see a tall figure standing before her, a man with rough hands and a kind smile. Beside him stood the little girl, her eyes shining with joy, as she held one of the baby shoes in her hands. "Do you like them?" "Emma," the man asked gently, his gaze soft, as he looked at his daughter. Emma nodded eagerly. "Yes, Papa, she's smiling." "Look." The man turned to Rosa, his eyes thoughtful. "How much for this one?" he asked. Rosa's heart fluttered in her chest, and for the first time that day, she smiled. $2, she whispered, her voice a little shaky. The man handed her the money without hesitation. "We'll take it." Emma beamed, clutching the shoe to her chest like a treasure. "Thank you," she said, her voice full of gratitude. Rosa felt a warmth spread through her, a rush of emotion she hadn't allowed herself to feel in years. For the first time, someone had seen the beauty in her work. Someone had seen her. As the man and his daughter walked away, Rosa stood still, a sense of disbelief washing over her. She had been seen. She wasn't invisible. And for the first time in a long time, the world felt a little less cold. "Tonight, I don't feel like the shadow of a forgotten widow. I feel like a person again." Rosa walked back to Daniel's house in a daze. The moment with the little girl and her father, the warmth she felt when they looked at her with kindness, replayed in her mind over and over. She hadn't realized how much she had been starving for a glimpse of humanity, for a sign that she wasn't invisible. That small interaction, that simple exchange of a few dollars, made her feel more alive than she had in years. The wind had picked up again, biting at her skin, but she didn't feel it. For the first time in months, Rosa didn't feel the weight of her loneliness pressing down on her. She wasn't just the woman who sat in the corner doing the work no one else wanted to acknowledge. She was someone worth noticing. When she arrived at Daniel's house, she was greeted by the soft glow of lantern lights spilling from the windows. The fire was crackling inside, and she could hear Emma's laughter coming from the other side of the door. Rosa hesitated for a moment, suddenly unsure of herself. What if they didn't want her to stay? What if her presence was just an act of charity, something they'd regret? Before she could talk herself out of it, the door opened, and Daniel stood there, his face lighting up with a smile that seemed to reach through the darkness. "Rosa," he said, stepping aside. "You made it back?" She nodded, stepping inside, and the warmth of the house enveloped her like a blanket. For the first time, she felt like she belonged here, like she wasn't just a guest or a burden. She was part of something. "Dinner's almost ready," Daniel said as he motioned for her to follow him into the kitchen. "Emma's been looking forward to seeing you." Emma was sitting at the table, her face beaming, as she looked up from the drawing she was working on. "Miss Rosa, look. I made a picture of us," she said, holding up the paper. The drawing was simple, a child's rendition of 3 people holding hands under a big tree, but it was the most beautiful thing Rosa had ever seen. Emma's love and trust were written in every line. Rosa felt her throat tighten. It had been so long since anyone had made her feel like she mattered, since anyone had cared enough to draw her into their world. She smiled at Emma, feeling the tears threatening to fall, but she held them back. "You're so talented," Rosa said softly, sitting beside her at the table. "That's a beautiful picture." Emma's grin grew even wider. "I want to keep it forever." "Can I give it to you?" she asked, holding the paper out to Rosa. Rosa's heart swelled. She didn't know how to answer. No one had ever given her something like this, something born out of pure affection, not out of pity or obligation. She took the picture gently, her fingers brushing Emma's small ones. "Thank you, Emma," she said, her voice thick with emotion. "I'll keep it forever." As they sat down to dinner, Daniel placed a bowl of hearty stew in front of Rosa. It was simple, but there was a comfort in it that made her feel like she was home. The 3 of them ate together in the warm glow of the firelight, sharing stories and laughter. For the first time in so long, Rosa felt like she wasn't alone. She wasn't a widow, a failure, or an outsider. She was a part of something. After dinner, Daniel cleared the dishes, and Emma disappeared into another room to play with her toys. Rosa sat by the fire, feeling the weight of the day begin to settle in her bones. She felt tired, but it was the kind of tired that came with peace, not the exhaustion of living in constant fear of rejection. "Thank you, Daniel," Rosa said after a long silence, her voice soft. "I don't know what to say. You've done so much for me." Daniel stopped what he was doing, turning to face her. "Rosa," he said quietly, "you don't owe me anything. You're part of this family now. You always have been, even before you realized it." He smiled, the warmth in his eyes reaching deep into her chest. "You're not a burden, Rosa. You never were." Rosa felt a lump form in her throat, and for a moment she was speechless. She had never been spoken to like that, with such kindness and sincerity. For so long she had believed she was too much of a burden for anyone to care, too flawed to be loved. But Daniel's words were like a balm to a wound she didn't know had been bleeding. "I don't know if I can ever repay you for all you've done," Rosa whispered, her voice trembling. You don't need to, Daniel replied. There's no debt between us. Just be here with us. That's all we need. Rosa nodded, feeling a weight lift off her shoulders. It wasn't just about the baby shoes or the market or the money. It was about this connection, this feeling of being seen, being valued, being loved. As she sat there looking into the flames, something inside her began to shift. The darkness that had followed her for so long, the weight of her past mistakes, began to feel a little less suffocating. She wasn't perfect. She didn't have all the answers, and she didn't know what the future held. But for the first time, she didn't need to have it all figured out. She didn't need to be anything other than herself. Tomorrow will be different, Rosa said to herself more than to Daniel. I won't hide anymore. Daniel glanced over at her, his expression thoughtful. What do you mean, I mean, she said, looking up at him. I've been hiding for so long, trying to be what everyone else wanted me to be. But I'm done with that. I'm done pretending. I don't have to prove anything to anyone. I'm enough just as I am. Daniel smiled, the warmth of his approval wrapping around her like a hug. You always were. Rosa's heart swelled as she looked at the family before her. For the first time in a long time, she felt like she belonged. She felt like she had a place in this world. Sometimes the things we make are not just creations. They're pieces of our soul given to the world. Rosa sat at the small table in Daniel's kitchen, the rhythmic sound of her needle stitching through fabric, a quiet comfort in the otherwise still morning. The sun had barely risen, casting pale light through the window, but she had already started her work. She was making baby shoes again, the same kind she had crafted for years, but this time there was something different about them. She wasn't stitching them out of obligation or a desire for approval anymore. She was making them because she loved the craft, because it was hers, and because she could. For the first time, she wasn't worried about whether anyone would buy them or if anyone would ever see them. She was simply creating, and that felt like freedom. Daniel had gone out to the barn with Emma earlier, and the house was quiet, save for the crackling of the fire and the soft rustle of fabric in Rosa's hands. She worked slowly, savoring the process, remembering how her mother had taught her to make these shoes when she was just a little girl. The same patterns, the same stitches, the same love carried through time. The door creaked open behind her, and Emma's excited voice cut through the silence. Miss Rosa. Look, I made something for you. Rosa turned surprised and saw the little girl holding out a drawing. Emma's small hands were clutching the paper tightly, and her face was beaming with pride. Rosa stood up, her heart warming at the sight. She reached out to take the drawing, careful not to tear it, and examined it with a smile. It was a picture of a house, a simple little cabin with a smiling sun above it, and 3 people standing hand in front. The people were drawn with exaggerated features, big eyes and wide smiles. But Rosa recognized herself, Daniel and Emma, in the crude shapes. Emma had drawn them as a family, standing together with the words, "My happy family," scrawled at the bottom. Rosa's breath caught in her throat. No one had ever drawn her into their world like this. No one had ever made her feel like she belonged, not even her own family. But here, in this little drawing, Emma had made her a part of something real. She felt the weight of the picture in her hands, and for the first time in years, she felt seen. She felt wanted. Thank you, Emma, Rosa said softly, her voice thick with emotion. She knelt down to the little girl's level, pulling her into a tight hug. This means more to me than you'll ever know. Emma hugged her back eagerly, her tiny arms wrapping around Rosa's neck. I'm glad you like it. I made it just for you, because you're part of our family now, right? Rosa blinked back tears, her heart swelling with love. Right, she whispered, holding the girl a little longer than usual. I'm part of the family. As they pulled away, Rosa looked at the picture again, and something inside her clicked. This wasn't just a drawing, it was a declaration. She was part of something. She wasn't invisible anymore. The rest of the day passed in a blur of contentment. Rosa spent the afternoon helping Daniel in the garden, tending to the plants and vegetables that Emma loved to pick and eat. They worked side by side, sharing stories of their past, their hopes and their dreams. For the first time, Rosa didn't feel like she had to hide parts of herself to fit in. She was accepted here not for what she could do for others, but for who she was. That was a new feeling. Later that evening, as they sat around the table for dinner, Emma asked Miss Rosa, "Can you teach me how to make baby shoes?" "Like you do, I want to learn how to make them for my dolls." Rosa smiled, her heart swelling with pride. "Of course, Emma. I'd love to teach you. But it's not just about making shoes, you know. It's about love. You have to put your heart into it. Every stitch, every cut, every piece of thread, you give a little bit of yourself to it." Emma's eyes lit up, her curiosity piqued. "Like magic." Rosa chuckled softly. "Yes, something like that. It's a little bit of magic and a lot of patience." As they ate, Rosa realized how much she had changed in just a short time. She wasn't the same woman who had walked into Daniel's house weeks ago, unsure of herself, afraid of being judged. She wasn't the woman who had hidden her work away, afraid of what others might say. Now she was creating not just for survival, but for joy. For herself, for Daniel, for Emma. She felt the warmth of their acceptance surrounding her, and the realization settled deep within her she had found her place. She was no longer just the forgotten widow. She was a woman with purpose, with love to give, and with a family who valued her. As the evening wore on and the fire crackled low in the hearth, Rosa leaned back in her chair, content. She glanced over at Daniel, who was smiling at her with that quiet understanding he always had. Emma was busy drawing again, her focus complete, as she added more details to her picture. In this small, simple home, Rosa had found a sense of peace she never thought possible. She had been broken, but now she was stitching herself back together, one small piece at a time. And for the first time, she was proud of what she had created, not just the shoes, but the family she was now a part of. The storm, I fear, isn't just the one outside. It's the one in my heart, the one that tells me I don't deserve this. Rosa woke to the sound of the wind howling outside. It wasn't the usual quiet morning breeze, but a sharp, biting gust that rattled the windows of the small cabin. The kind of wind that signaled change, something disruptive and unsettling. She lay still in bed for a moment, listening to the storm, her thoughts swirling like the snow outside. It had been weeks since she'd come to Daniel's house, and things were different now. She wasn't the same woman who had arrived here in fear, thinking she was just another burden. No, she had started to believe she was part of this family. But there was a nagging voice in her head that wouldn't let go. It whispered in the quiet moments, telling her that it was all too good to be true, that she didn't belong, that she didn't deserve this peace. She pushed the thoughts away and sat up, pulling the covers around her. The warmth of the fire still lingered in the living room, a welcoming reminder that she wasn't alone. But today, the house felt quieter than usual. Daniel had left early to tend to the cattle, and Emma had gone with him. The stillness pressed in around her, filling the space between the walls. The storm outside seemed to mirror the storm brewing in her heart. Rosa stood and moved to the window, peering out at the swirling snow. The world beyond the cabin was hidden in a blanket of white, indistinct and unreachable. It felt like a metaphor for everything she was feeling, isolated, alone, trapped. She turned away from the window, taking a deep breath. She had made a decision, one she hoped would bring some peace. She was going to visit her old home today, the one she had left behind when she married Marcus. Her family was still there in the house on the edge of the prairie. She had not spoken to them in years, and the thought of facing them again made her stomach twist with anxiety. But she had to do it. She needed to understand if she could ever truly be free of the guilt and shame that clung to her. She needed to know if she could still face the people who had shaped her into the woman she had been. She needed closure. The journey was long, but Rosa had grown used to the isolation of the plains. The walk across the frozen ground was a familiar one, though it felt heavier today. With every step, she felt the weight of her past pressing down on her shoulders, threatening to crush her under its burden. The cold seeped into her bones, but it wasn't the cold she feared. It was the confrontation with herself that awaited her at the end of the path. By the time she reached her old home, the sun had begun to dip low on the horizon, casting long shadows across the land. The house loomed in front of her, a ghost from another life. It had been years since she had last stood here, since she had walked away with nothing but her dreams and the man she had loved. Marcus was gone now, and Rosa had never returned. The door creaked open as she approached the house, as silent and empty as it had been when she left. Inside, the air smelled of dust and neglect. The once warm, familiar rooms now felt cold and uninviting. She stepped inside, her heart pounding in her chest, and the memories came rushing back. There in the corner was the old rocking chair, where her mother had sat for hours, knitting and telling stories. Rosa could almost hear her voice, the way it would rise and fall as she spoke of the past. The house felt haunted by the echoes of everything she had once believed in, everything she had hoped for. And then she heard it, the sound of footsteps on the porch. Rosa froze, her heart racing. She wasn't alone. The door swung open, and there, standing in the doorway, was Margaret Standing Bear, Rosa's mother-in-law, the woman who had made her feel like an outsider in her own home for years. Margaret's face was hard, her expression unreadable. "You shouldn't have come back," Margaret said, her voice cold and detached. "This place is for people who belong here, not for you." Rosa felt the familiar sting of her words, but she stood her ground. She wasn't the same woman who had left this house all those years ago. She had found something in herself, something stronger than the woman Margaret had always seen. "I came because I needed to," Rosa said, her voice steady, despite the storm of emotions raging inside her. "I needed to understand if I could ever be free of this." Margaret's gaze narrowed, and for a moment Rosa thought she saw a flicker of something, regret, maybe, or fear. But it was gone in an instant, replaced by the familiar scorn. "You've always been a burden," Rosa Margaret said, her words sharp and cutting. "You always will be." Rosa's chest tightened. She had expected this. But she had also expected something else, a change, maybe a shift in how she saw herself. She had come here to face the woman who had never given her a chance, who had reduced her to nothing more than a joke, a failure. But what she realized in that moment was that Margaret's judgment no longer mattered. "I don't need your approval anymore," Rosa said, her voice filled with quiet conviction. "I'm not here to prove anything to you. I'm here for me. I'm here because I deserve to know I can walk away from the things that have held me back." Margaret stood there for a moment, her face unreadable. Then, without a word, she turned and walked away, disappearing into the night. Rosa stood there, her heart pounding, the words hanging in the air like a final confrontation with her pet. She didn't know if it was victory or defeat, but it didn't matter. She had said what she needed to say, and that was enough. The storm outside had settled into a quiet snowfall, and as Rosa walked back toward Daniel's house, she felt lighter. She wasn't sure if the weight of the past would ever fully lift, but she knew she could face it now. She was stronger than she had been before. I cannot go back to the life I had, but can I truly belong here with them? Rosa stood at the edge of the cabin, her hands clasped tightly together as she looked out at the rolling plains. The snow had stopped falling, but the air was still crisp, the scent of winter sharp and cold in her lungs. It was a beautiful sight, the wide open sky stretching endlessly before her. But today it felt heavy, as though it was pressing down on her chest, urging her to move but also making it difficult to take a single step forward. She had spent the morning working beside Daniel and Emma, helping with chores around the house, but her mind was elsewhere. Every time she tried to focus, her thoughts drifted back to her past, to the house she had left behind, to Margaret's bitter words. The encounter with her mother-in-law had left a scar, one that even the warmth of Daniel's home couldn't heal. Could she truly belong here with them? She had found a new family, one that saw her for who she was, but the remnants of her old life still clung to her, haunting her like shadows that refused to fade. She wasn't sure if she was strong enough to face the consequences of staying. Could she leave the ghosts of her past behind, or would they always be a part of her? Her heart ached with uncertainty, the familiar doubt creeping back into her thoughts. She couldn't imagine going back to her life before, couldn't bear the idea of returning to the suffocating silence of the house where she had once been nothing more than a servant, invisible to everyone around her. But how could she stay here when the weight of her past still loomed over her? Miss Rosa, the voice startled her, and she turned to see Emma standing behind her, holding a small bundle of wildflowers in her hands. The little girl's eyes were bright, her smile wide and full of warmth. "Look what I picked for you," Emma said, holding the flowers out to her. Rosa's heart softened at the sight. The flowers were simple, their petals white and delicate, but in Emma's hands they were a gift of pure love. She knelt down to Emma's level, taking the flowers gently. "Thank you, Emma," Rosa said softly, her voice thick with emotion. "These are beautiful." Emma beamed, her hands resting on her hips as she stood proudly. "I thought you'd like them. You're part of our family now, right?" Rosa's chest tightened at the words, a lump forming in her throat. She wanted to tell Emma that she wasn't sure if she truly belonged, that her heart was torn between the past she had left behind and the new life she was trying to build. But looking into Emma's innocent eyes, she realized that no words could fully explain the turmoil she felt inside. Emma saw her as part of the family, and that was all that mattered in that moment. "I am part of your family," Rosa whispered, her voice filled with quiet conviction. "And I always will be." Emma smiled even wider, her eyes lighting up. "I'm so glad." As they walked back inside, the warmth of the fire greeted them, the flickering light casting soft shadows across the room. Daniel was sitting at the table cleaning his hands after working outside. His eyes met Rosa's as she entered, and he smiled warmly, the kind of smile that made her feel like she was finally home. "You all right?" he asked, his voice low and gentle. Rosa hesitated for a moment, then nodded. "I'm fine," she said, though the words didn't come as easily as they once did. "Just thinking." Daniel raised an eyebrow, his gaze softening with understanding. About what? Rosa sat down beside him, her hands still clutching the flowers Emma had picked. She stared at them for a moment, her mind racing. She could feel the weight of the question pressing on her chest, could feel the uncertainty gnawing at her from the inside. But for the first time she felt like she could speak the truth without fear of judgment. "I don't know if I can stay here," Rosa said, her voice barely above a whisper. "I don't know if I can keep pretending that my past doesn't matter. I've spent so long hiding from it, but it's still there in the back of my mind. It's always with me." Daniel's face softened, and he reached out, placing a reassuring hand on hers. "You don't have to pretend, Rosa," he said quietly. "You don't have to run from your past. You're not the same woman who left that house. You've found a new family here, one that sees you for who you are, not for the mistakes of the past." Rosa's eyes filled with tears as she looked up at him, feeling the weight of his words settle into her heart. She had been running for so long, hiding from the pain, from the memories. But here in this house with Daniel and Emma, she didn't have to hide anymore. She didn't have to be afraid. "I'm scared," she admitted, her voice trembling. "I don't know if I can fully let go of everything that came before. I don't know if I can truly be free." Daniel squeezed her hand gently. "You don't have to do it alone," he said softly. "We're here. You have a place here, Rosa. You always will." Rosa looked at him, her heart heavy with gratitude. For the first time in so long, she felt like she wasn't just surviving. She was living. She was part of something. And even though the scars of her past would always be there, she knew that they didn't have to define her. As the fire crackled in the background, Rosa let out a deep breath, feeling the tension in her chest begin to ease. She didn't have all the answers, and the road ahead would still be hard. But for the first time, she didn't feel like she was walking it alone. "This is the moment I've been waiting for. Will I stand tall, or will I crumble beneath the weight of fear?" Rosa stood in front of the door, her hand on the handle, heart pounding, as though it wanted to break free of her chest. Outside, the wind was howling fierce and unforgiving, pushing against the walls of the cabin. But inside, a different kind of storm raged within her, a storm of doubt, fear, and uncertainty. She wasn't sure if she was ready for what awaited her outside, for what she had to face next. The decision to stay with Daniel and Emma had been hard, but it had been the right one. Every day had brought a new layer of healing, a new understanding of herself, and yet, as she stood there now, it felt like the past was catching up with her. Margaret's words from the other day still echoed in her mind, the sharpness of them piercing through her resolve. "You've always been a burden, Rosa," Margaret had said, her voice cold and unforgiving. Rosa's hands tightened on the door handle, her fingers digging into the wood. She had heard those words too many times before, had lived with them for years. But today, for the first time, they didn't have the same power over her. She had fought for this life, fought for the peace she now had with Daniel and Emma, and she wasn't about to let anyone take that from her. She pushed the door open, stepping into the cold wind, her breath catching in the sharp air. The snow had settled, but the ground was still slippery, the world around her a frozen landscape. Her boots crunched against the ice as she walked toward the barn where Daniel had gone earlier that morning. The sun was low in the sky, casting long shadows across the yard, and for a moment everything seemed still quiet. But as Rosa approached the barn, she could see Daniel in the distance, working on something with Emma by his side. The sight of them so effortlessly together, so unburdened by the past, struck her with a sense of longing. It was the kind of longing that made her wonder if she truly belonged here in this peaceful home with this family that had taken her in without question. It was the kind of longing that made her doubt her worth despite everything she had fought for. Rosa. She turned at the sound of Daniel's voice, and for a brief moment her heart fluttered in her chest. He was walking toward her, his face warm with that familiar smile. Emma was beside him, holding a bundle of hay in her small arms, her face alight with excitement. "We've got a surprise for you," Daniel said as he reached her. He placed a hand gently on her shoulder, his touch a steadying presence. Rosa's heart sank a little as she looked between them, unsure of what this surprise might be. Had they discovered something about her past? Were they about to ask her to leave, to go back to the life she had so desperately tried to escape? "What is it?" Rosa asked, her voice trembling more than she intended. "Come see, Emma," said eagerly, tugging on her sleeve, her tiny fingers pulling Rosa toward the barn. Rosa followed Emma, trying to calm the nerves that twisted inside her. As they reached the barn door, Daniel pushed it open, revealing something she hadn't expected, a small workbench set up in the corner of the barn, with tools and scraps of fabric laid out on the surface. "We thought you might like a place to work," Daniel said quietly. "A space of your own where you can make whatever you like." Rosa stared at the bench, the sight of it overwhelming her. It was simple, but it was exactly what she had needed, a place where she could create without judgment, where she could work in peace, surrounded by the support of the family she had come to love. Her eyes filled with tears as she turned toward Daniel, her heart full of gratitude. "I don't know what to say," she whispered, her voice thick with emotion. "I've never had a space like this. Never had the chance to create without fear." Daniel smiled, his eyes soft. "You don't need to say anything. Just do what makes you happy." Rosa looked down at the workbench, the reality of it settling in. This was her space now. This was her chance to create, not for anyone else, but for herself. The thought was both terrifying and exhilarating. "I don't want to disappoint you," she said, her voice small. "I'm not sure I know how to just make things for myself. I've always made things for others, for the approval of others." "You don't have to worry about that here," Daniel replied. "You don't need to prove anything to us. We just want you to be happy." Rosa swallowed hard, the weight of his words sinking deep into her chest. She had spent so long trying to live up to the expectations of others, trying to please the people who had never truly seen her. But here with Daniel and Emma, it was different. They didn't ask anything of her. They just wanted her to be herself. She stood there for a moment, feeling the cold wind seep through the cracks of the barn, but the warmth in her chest was enough to keep her grounded. She wasn't sure if she was ready to let go of the past, of all the doubts that still clouded her mind. But she knew one thing: for the first time she was ready to try. Ready to let herself create, let herself be seen without fear. "I'll try," she said finally, looking at Daniel and Emma with newfound resolve. "I'll try to be the woman I've always wanted to be." Daniel nodded, his smile reassuring. "You've already come so far, Rosa. We're proud of you." As they stood there together in the barn, Rosa realized something that she hadn't fully understood. Until now, she wasn't alone anymore. She didn't have to carry the weight of her past on her own. She had found a family, and in that family, she had found the courage to face herself. The storm inside her had not fully passed, but it was quieter now. The winds had calmed, and the road ahead was clearer. Rosa knew that the journey wouldn't be easy, but for the first time she was ready to walk it, with her head held high. "I will not hide my love, nor will I let anyone make me feel less than worthy." The sun was setting as Rosa walked through the fields, the cold air biting at her skin. She had spent the day working in the barn, organizing the fabric scraps, and sorting through the tools Daniel had gathered for her. She had felt a sense of purpose, a sense of peace that she hadn't realized she was missing. But now, as the light dimmed and the world around her quieted, a new weight pressed down on her heart. For the first time in a long while, she felt like she was truly a part of something, like she had found her place. But in the quiet of the evening, the doubts began to resurface. Could she really be worthy of the life she was starting to build here? Could she fully embrace the love Daniel had shown her? Or would the ghosts of her past continue to haunt her? She stopped at the edge of the field, looking out at the horizon, her breath fogging in the cold air. Her thoughts were a tangled mess of fears and uncertainties. But there was one truth she couldn't deny: her heart was beginning to open in a way it never had before. She was beginning to feel things she hadn't allowed herself to feel in years. joy, hope, and for the first time in her life, the possibility of love. Rosa. The voice broke through her thoughts, and she turned to see Daniel walking toward her. His face was serious, but his eyes were warm like they always were when he looked at her. There was a quiet understanding in his gaze as if he knew the battle she was fighting within herself. Daniel, she said softly, her voice trembling slightly. I've been thinking about everything. He stopped in front of her, his expression softening. I know. I've been thinking too. Rosa swallowed hard, her throat tightening. I don't know if I can do this. I don't know if I can fully let go of the past, of the things I've been running from. I'm scared that I'll never be enough. Daniel stepped closer, his hand reaching out to gently cup her cheek. Rosa, you are enough. You've always been enough. You don't have to prove anything to anyone, especially not to me. Her heart ached at his words, and for the first time she allowed herself to believe them. She closed her eyes for a moment, letting the warmth of his touch sink in, feeling the weight of the fear that had been holding her back begin to lift. I'm afraid, Daniel, she whispered, her voice breaking. I'm afraid of how much I'm starting to care for you. I'm afraid that one day you'll look at me the way everyone else has, like I'm a burden, like I'm not worth loving. He gently pulled her into his arms, his embrace strong and steady. Rosa, I've never once seen you as a burden, and I never will. You're not what others have said about you. You are the woman I see in front of me right now, brave, strong, and worthy of love. Tears filled her eyes as she buried her face against his chest, overwhelmed by the tenderness in his words. She had never allowed herself to believe in the kind of love he was offering, love that wasn't conditional, that didn't come with strings attached. But in his arms, she felt a flicker of hope. Maybe, just maybe, she could believe in it. She could believe in herself. Are you ready to stop hiding, Rosa? Daniel asked, his voice soft but firm. Are you ready to let go of the fear that's holding you back? And let love in Rosa pulled back slightly, looking up at him. Her heart was racing, but it wasn't out of fear. It was because she realized in that moment that she was ready. Ready to face the unknown, ready to let go of the past, and ready to love without reservation. I'm ready, she said, her voice filled with determination. I'm ready to stop hiding. Daniel smiled, his eyes lighting up with something between relief and joy. He leaned down, his lips brushing against her forehead, and for the first time Rosa didn't feel like she was running away from anything. She was standing still in this moment, and it felt like the world was finally at peace. But as they stood there wrapped in each other's arms, a sense of unease began to settle over Rosa. She knew the road ahead wouldn't be without its challenges. The scars of her past were still there, and she couldn't forget the rejection she had faced. But as Daniel held her, as Emma's smile flashed in her mind, she knew one thing: she didn't have to face it alone. I'm not perfect, she said, her voice trembling slightly but full of conviction. I'm still learning, still healing. But I want to be here with you. I want to be the woman who can stand tall without fear. And you will be, Daniel, replied, his voice firm with belief. You already are. The wind shifted, the cold air brushing past them, but it didn't matter. They were together now, and for the first time in a long time, Rosa felt like she could breathe. I will not hide my love, nor will I let anyone make me feel less than worthy. The warmth of the fire crackled softly in the hearth, the flames casting flickering shadows across the room. Rosa sat in the chair by the window, her hands folded in her lap, but her mind was far from still. Her heart was racing with a mixture of excitement and fear. The day had arrived, the moment she had been waiting, for the moment she had to face not just her own heart, but the world around her. Daniel was beside her, his presence as steady as ever, his hand resting gently on her shoulder. He hadn't spoken much about the coming day, but she knew what it meant. He had been patient with her, always understanding, always kind. But today was different. Today, everything would change. Rosa stood and walked over to the small table where she had placed the baby shoes she had worked on for the last few weeks. Each pair was carefully crafted, stitched with care and love, but now they seemed heavy, almost burdened with the weight of her own expectations. She wasn't just making shoes anymore. She was making something more. She was offering a piece of herself to the world, and that felt terrifying. Daniel stood up behind her, his voice low and reassuring. "Rosa, you don't have to do this if you're not ready, but you've come so far, and I believe in you." His words settled over her like a blanket, and for the first time in days, the fear began to ebb away. She had come so far. She had fought for this moment, fought for a place in this world, and now she couldn't hold back. Not anymore. Not when everything she had been searching for was right here with him, with Emma, with the life they were building together. "I'm ready," Rosa said, her voice firm, even if it trembled slightly. She picked up the first pair of baby shoes, holding them in her hands as if they were the key to her future. "I've spent too long hiding, Daniel. I won't hide anymore." The look in his eyes softened, and he reached out, taking her hand in his. "You don't have to hide from me. You've never had to. I've seen you, Rosa. You're enough just as you are." She nodded, swallowing the lump in her throat. She had heard these words before, but today they felt different. Today they felt like a promise. Together they made their way to the market, walking side by side with Emma running ahead of them, her laughter filling the cold air. Rosa felt the familiar weight of the basket of baby shoes in her hands, but it didn't feel as heavy now. Each step she took felt lighter, like the burden she had carried for so long was finally starting to lift. When they arrived at the market, the bustling crowd welcomed them with the familiar sights and sounds, vendors calling out to passers-by, children playing, the smells of freshly baked bread and roasted chestnuts wafting through the air. Rosa took a deep breath, inhaling the life around her. This was where she had always wanted to be, where she could be part of something bigger than herself. But even as she set up her stall arranging the baby shoes, just as she had done the last time, doubt crept in. What if no one came? What if they didn't care? What if her work, her love, her effort was all for nothing? Rosa glanced at Daniel, who was setting up nearby with Emma, and for a moment she considered walking away. But then she remembered the promise she had made to herself, to be seen, to stop hiding. She wouldn't run away this time. As the day went on, people passed by her stall, some pausing to glance at the shoes, some even picking them up and admiring the intricate stitching. But no one stopped to buy. Rosa's heart sank with each passing hour, the weight of rejection growing heavier. She tried to stay composed, but the doubt, the fear began to claw at her again. She was invisible, just like she had always feared. And then, just as she was beginning to lose hope, a familiar voice called out to her. "These are beautiful." Rosa's breath caught in her throat as she looked up to see the man from the other day, the one who had bought the baby shoes for his daughter. He was standing there, a warm smile on his face, his daughter Emma by his side. Rosa's heart fluttered, a spark of hope reigniting in her chest. "I was hoping to find you here," the man said, walking toward her. "My daughter loves the shoes you made. She won't stop talking about them." Rosa felt a wave of emotion wash over her as the man reached for his wallet. "How much for 2 more pairs?" he asked, his eyes never leaving her face. Rosa smiled, her heart full. $2 each. Without hesitation, he handed her the money, and then, to her surprise, he reached into his pocket and pulled out an extra bill. "For your kindness," he said, pressing the money into her hand. You're worth more than what you're asking for. Rosa's chest tightened, and she fought to keep the tears at bay. This wasn't just about the money, it was about being seen, being valued. For the first time, someone was recognizing her work, not just as a product to be bought, but as something real, something worthy. As the man walked away with his daughter, Rosa looked at the money in her hand, but it wasn't the bills that mattered. It was the feeling of being seen, of being valued for who she was and what she had to offer. She had made it. She had stepped into the world and for once wasn't afraid of what others might think. Daniel came over to her, his smile wide as he saw what had happened. "I told you," he said quietly. "You're enough. You always have been." Rosa nodded, feeling a sense of peace wash over her. She had faced her fears, and she had won. This was just the beginning. We are not just a family by blood, we are a family by choice. Rosa woke early, the faint light of dawn breaking through the frost-covered window. The air was still and cold, but inside there was warmth. The house felt full, not just with the sounds of Emma playing in the corner or the crackling fire, but with something deeper. It was a sense of belonging, a feeling that had settled into her bones over the past few months. For the first time, she felt like she was truly part of something, not just by circumstance, but by choice. The past had a way of lingering like shadows that stretched long and thin into every corner of her life. But today, Rosa felt something different. She wasn't weighed down by the past anymore, or at least not in the same way. She had made her peace with it. She had stepped into the light, into this life, and she knew it was hers to embrace. As she stood up and moved toward the kitchen, her thoughts drifted to the journey she had been on. She had started out running from the shadows, from the mistakes, and the people who had made her feel like she was never enough. Now she was standing in a home that wasn't just hers by accident. It was hers because she had fought for it, because Daniel and Emma had chosen her just as she had chosen them. Daniel was already at the stove when she entered the kitchen, humming quietly to himself as he stirred the pot. His presence was calm and grounding, and as always, she felt a sense of peace simply being near him. "Good morning," she said, her voice still thick with sleep, but steady, firm. It was a sound that felt more like herself now, more like someone who belonged here. "Morning," Daniel replied with a smile. He glanced over his shoulder at her. "The coffee's ready if you want it. I'll be done here in a minute." Rosa nodded and moved to the counter, pouring herself a cup of coffee, savoring the warmth of the mug in her hands. She watched as Emma played with a wooden horse at the table, her laughter ringing through the room. It was a sound that in another life might have been foreign to Rosa, but now it felt like home. "I was thinking," Rosa said after a beat, "maybe we should start making things for the community. Not just for the market, but for the people here, the ones who have supported us." Daniel turned around, his eyes thoughtful. "What do you mean, I don't know?" Rosa admitted, taking a sip of her coffee. "But I've been thinking a lot about how we can give back. I've spent so much of my life taking love, taking space. But now I think it's time to give." Daniel smiled at her, his eyes full of understanding. "I think that's a wonderful idea. We've been blessed by the people here, and I know they'd appreciate whatever you choose to share." Rosa felt a warmth bloom in her chest. It wasn't just about making baby shoes or selling them at the market anymore. It was about using her hands, her heart, to give something back to the community that had given her so much. She had been given a second chance, a family, a place to belong. It was time for her to step fully into that role, not just as a woman who had been saved, but as someone who could give. As the days passed, Rosa threw herself into her new mission. She worked alongside Daniel, Emma, and even the neighbors, creating small gifts, offering her handmade goods to those in need. She made scarves, mittens, blankets, things that people could use to keep warm through the harsh winters. She didn't do it for praise. She didn't need recognition anymore. She simply wanted to be part of something bigger than herself, to show the world that she could be more than the mistakes of her past. One afternoon, as she handed over a bundle of mittens to a young mother in the village, the woman looked at her with gratitude, her eyes softening. "You don't know how much this means to us," she said, her voice thick with emotion. "I don't know what we would have done without you." Rosa felt a rush of warmth spread through her. It wasn't just the thank you, it was the knowing. She had found her place. She wasn't just making things, she was making a difference. She was part of a community that valued her not because of her past, but because of the love and care she was willing to give. That night, as she sat with Daniel and Emma by the fire, Rosa realized something that she had known for a long time, but hadn't fully embraced. Family wasn't just about blood. It was about choice. It was about the people you chose to surround yourself with, the people who saw you for who you were, flaws and all, and still chose you. Daniel had chosen her, Emma had chosen her, and the community had chosen her. They didn't see her as the woman she used to be, the one defined by her failures. They saw her as Rosa, the woman who gave, who loved, who made a difference. "I'm grateful," Rosa said softly, looking between Daniel and Emma. "For both of you. For everything." Daniel smiled and pulled her into his side, his arm wrapping around her shoulders. "We're grateful for you too, Rosa. You've brought more into our lives than you'll ever know." Rosa smiled and rested her head against his chest, feeling at peace. For the first time in a long while, she didn't feel like she was just surviving. She was living. And the love she had found, the family she had chosen, was more than she had ever hoped for. Rosa stood at the edge of the porch, looking out across the field as the sun dipped below the horizon, painting the sky in shades of pink and orange. The wind had died down, leaving only the soft rustle of leaves in the trees and the distant sound of birds settling for the night. The world around her felt still peaceful, as though it had been waiting for this moment, just as she had. The past year had been a journey of unimaginable change, a series of small steps that had led her to this very moment. She had come to this place as a woman defined by the mistakes of her past, carrying the weight of rejection and shame. But now, as she stood here with Daniel and Emma by her side, she saw herself in a new light, strong, whole, and loved. She had found the courage to stop hiding, to face her fears head on, and accept the love that had been offered to her, not out of obligation, but out of true care. The scars of her past would always remain, but they no longer controlled her. Instead, they had become part of the story she carried with her, a story of resilience, growth, and the unshakable belief that she could rebuild no matter how broken she once felt. Behind her, she could hear Emma's laughter, the sound of the little girl playing with the animals in the yard. Daniel was with her, helping her fix the fence that had been damaged by the winter storms. Their voices carried through the air light and full of life, a sound that filled Rosa's heart with warmth. For the first time, she truly understood what it meant to be part of a family. It wasn't just about blood or the ties that bound them by birth. It was about choice. It was about standing together, supporting each other through the hardest of times, and loving without hesitation. It was about giving, about showing up for each other, even when the world seemed against you. Rosa had never expected to find a family like this, but here with Daniel and Emma, she had found more than she had ever dared to hope for. And in return, she had learned how to give, how to offer the love she had always kept hidden, afraid that it would never be accepted. She walked back into the house, her heart light, her mind at peace. Inside, the fire crackled in the hearth, casting a warm glow across the room. Daniel was sitting at the table, watching her with that quiet smile she had come to love. Emma was curled up on the couch with a book, her small body wrapped in the blanket Rosa had made for her months ago. The sight of them so content, so at home, made Rosa's heart swell with a love that she hadn't known was possible. "Come sit with us, Daniel," said his voice soft, but full of warmth. "We've been waiting for you." Rosa smiled and sat down beside him, feeling the weight of the day of the year finally lift from her shoulders. She wasn't just surviving anymore. She was living. She was part of something. And for the first time, she felt like she had truly found her place in the world. As Emma looked up from her book and smiled at Rosa, the feeling of belonging grew even stronger. The journey had been long and difficult, but it had brought her here into a life filled with love, laughter, and the promise of tomorrow. Rosa didn't know what the future held. She didn't know if the challenges would ever fully disappear, but for the first time in her life she didn't fear them, because she knew that no matter what came next, she wouldn't face it alone. She had a family now, a family that chose her, a family that loved her. The past had shaped her, but it no longer defined her. She had walked through fire, but the woman who stood here now was stronger, braver, and more whole than the woman who had walked into this home months ago. And as she sat by the fire, surrounded by the people she loved, Rosa finally understood the most important truth. Love isn't just about finding someone to share your life with. It's about choosing to love and be loved, regardless of your past, regardless of your mistakes. It's about knowing that no matter what, you are worthy of that love. In the quiet of the room, as the fire burned low and Emma's soft breathing filled the space, Rosa knew that she had found her home, not just in this house, but in herself. She was enough. She always had been. And as the night stretched on with the stars sparkling outside and the warmth of family inside, Rosa realized that she had finally truly come home.